This week on Dialogue, the national conversation continues, a follow-up discussion with Mr. Y. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Wayne Porter is a captain in the United States Navy who serves in the office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Additionally, he's co-author of the paper A National Strategic Narrative, originally written using the pseudonym Mr. Y. Robert Litvak is Vice President for Programs and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Previously, he served as Director for Non-Proliferation for the National Security Council. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for joining us. Wayne, we should acknowledge that the other half of Mr. Y couldn't be with us today, Mark Mickleby, starting a new job, and so we gave him a day off.
I'm only half Y, so that's exactly right.
Half Y. Let's rewind the tape here and go back to the initial idea for the paper between you and Mark and Puck. Where did it come from?
The paper, and I will give this caveat as I always do every time Puck and I speak about this. I just want to make sure that people understand it really does reflect only our views. It doesn't reflect official U.S. policy or the opinions and policy of my boss, Admiral Mullen, nor the Navy or Marines. That said, I've been with Admiral Mullen for quite a long time. I've been with him 3 of my last 4 tours. In each case, it was basically in the same capacity as a special assistant for strategy in some capacity. And about almost 3 years ago now, I had been working on an approach to strategy that dealt more with global trends than it did with sovereignty, issues of sovereignty or threat and risk. And oddly enough, Puck had been at the same time in a separate effort, was working for Admiral Olson at Special Operations Command on a new strategy for Special Forces, which actually was later published. And we were working very much along the same lines. Admiral Mullen had seen a briefing that was done by that group. He said, you need to get in touch with that guy because...
So you hadn't met previously?
Never. So this was October of 2008. He said, I think you have a lot of ideas in common. About 9 months later, again, so this was July of 2009, I guess, Admiral Mullen had asked me to take a look at a grand strategy, give some thought based on a paper I had written and presented to him and Secretary Gates. He said, why don't you give some thought to what a grand strategy might look like? So I contacted Puck, and that's how we started looking at this.
And what was the initial reaction to folks that you shared it with?
It's always actually been received pretty well. I think Puck and I think very similarly. We process information the same way, which is generally orthogonal to the way everyone else processes information in the building. We are what I would call very nonlinear thinkers. We're almost incapable of restricting ourselves to defense and security in isolation from a much larger perspective. So it's just the way that we think. I think probably that's why Admiral Mullen has kept me around and has put up with me for this amount of time, that I can offer a perspective that maybe he wouldn't get from conventional strategists or from conventional planners. So I think it was received quite well. I think there is an appreciation that it's a very complex environment and a very complex strategic environment that we live in now, and that maybe we need to relook at all of the tools that we would use as a nation to pursue our enduring national interests.
Rob, where typically in American history has this type of conversation come from? Who takes the initiative on defining these narratives?
Well, the timing of such conversations is cyclical. I mean, great events like the end of a war will occasion that. I mean, World War II, the original X article emerged from the end of the Second World War and the advent of the Soviet threat, which required a new conception of international relations that Kennan articulated, as well as the National Security Act of 1947 to line up the U.S. government with this new environment. There have also been periods, and I think this is an issue that intersects with this, of concerns about American decline, that America is sort of losing its edge internationally in areas of science and technology, essentially kind of the domestic sources of American strength. And I think what one sees in the current era are both of those trends coming together. Namely, the system is changing. It's not that the United States is and it's, I suppose one should phrase it as a debatable proposition, in decline, but we see in the international system rising powers, notably China, as well as transnational trends that are beyond the sovereign control of any single state, which have called into question the nature of the international system and what that will require, as well as a sense that we've just gone through a deep recession. We're still coming out of it, and we averted a Great Depression, but a sense that there's something qualitatively different about this recession than the typical economic cyclical recession, and that has to do with the domestic sources of American strength. So I think these two conditions, there was a conflation of them, and that has given particular resonance to this, to the piece, the Y article, as well as the authorship, where the article's coming from, because it's one would not expect in conventional kind of frame of thinking that this argument would come out of the militaries and institutions. It's really striking. I think that's another reason why it resonated so well. And we've talked about the piece, but I think I'd ask Captain Porter to briefly characterize the core argument of it for those who've are not familiar with it.
Yes, sir. And it's interesting listening to your comments, because those things did occur to us, obviously, and we do feel the urgency to us in 2009 was that not only did we recognize, I think, that we are at an inflection point in history, and I think part of that, I have come to realize, I think more and more, part of that inflection point is the result of the advent of this epical shift for civilization, which has been the information age. I think it's presented us at an inflection point in history.
So it's not the end of a war, or it's not, it's a cumulative thing? It's this
I think absolutely.
Globalization?
I think it is the realization that was brought on with social networking and the information age, that globalization actually has had an epical impact on civilization that is so significant within the system we are unable to recognize it right now. I honestly would characterize this as significant as the advent of the Enlightenment in the 1600s that was manifested through the work of Descartes and Newton and others. And that led to a whole different way of looking at the environment. That it led to the scientific method. Actually, Newton wrote that into the Principia. And it brought about an inductionist or a reductionist perspective, but the ability to apply linear analysis. I think the thing that has changed materially to us is that the information age has brought about an awareness that our environment is completely interconnected. There is a complexity to this that can't be analyzed linearly, that has to have new tools applied, complexity theory or chaos theory, whatever it is, but that it's an opportunity. And to your point, sir, that is exactly what we wanted to capture. The thing that bothered us most about the strategies that we see every day in our jobs on our side of the river and across the river is that they are almost universally based on anticipating and countering known risk and threat. And our sense is that we have entered an age in which we need to overcome that sense of fear and seize opportunities, seize the opportunity to shape the environment of the future, as opposed to simply being resilient to it. Mm-hmm. And that's where we came up with this concept of sustainability, which isn't maintaining the status quo, it's sustaining a leadership role in continuing to develop our prosperity and security, which we see are interdependent. We also felt that interdependence needs to be recognized in a complementarity and congruence between foreign and domestic policies, so that we demonstrate the efficacy of our own system in America, and we can export then that as smart power, not abroad, so that others can emulate that.
And power beyond military. You're looking at the
Absolutely.
big picture.
We think that what this whole thing led us to recognize is that the tools that were used to contain the spread of global communism were tools of control, and that dealt much more with the elements of viewing the environment as a closed system in engineering, where you can manipulate enough variables to arrive at a deterministic result. Truthfully, the environment isn't like that. We see it every day. It is highly complex. It's an open system. You can't really control anything as much as you can hope to influence it. And therefore, we thought that strength really comes from credible influence, not from force or power alone. So that we must have strength as a nation, but it should manifest itself through values in a incredible influence.
Rob, you've been involved in these discussions for a long time, from the National Security Council through. How revolutionary is this as a way of thinking about it, this big picture approach? I have a sense that we've thought in silos traditionally.
Well, certainly we've thought in silos, and debates have been too often kind of compartmentalized. And I think what's really one of the strengths of this piece is that it is truly synthetic, working across the continuum of instruments of power, and talks in a very powerful way about how hard power, I guess what in the Pentagon they call the kinetic side of business, can be integrated, has its place, but that the non-military dimensions of American power have been neglected. We see this playing out in our current conflict zones, where we want to have a civilian follow-on in Iraq. And the State Department doesn't have adequate resources, personnel. Of course, a secure environment for their people to work in is a prerequisite. But we've seen these questions playing out in specific context in the here and now, and have witnessed, for example, Secretary of Defense Gates advocating that the State Department be given the proper tools to do the business. And he and Secretary Clinton have worked together in trying to really move on this type of approach to the extent that our current politics and circumstances permit.
Sounds inside out. The Secretary of Defense trying to cut the budget and give more money to states.
This is the beauty or the irony of the similarity between the X and Y article. It wasn't our idea to name it the Y article. That was Dr. Slaughter, and actually Tom Friedman came up with that, both of them independently. But the irony of this is that it wasn't Kennan's notion necessarily to use the military as the first tool of containment. That was actually Nietzsche, I believe. So Kennan, I think, saw many more advantages to American economic growth and competition as a tool to contain what he saw clearly as an unsustainable ideology. The truth is then that, and that is what's ironic about this, is that what became a pretty muscular strategy of containment through the military was developed originally, or the notion for it came from the State Department. So the irony of, or just the coincidence maybe, that there was two people in the Pentagon who were dispassionately looking at the situation, just the same as someone from State Department was dispassionately looking at his environment. I think it's natural that you come up with whatever you believe the proper tools are. And I think the tools of influence clearly extend far beyond just the military, and Secretary Gates and Amber Mullen have said this repeatedly.
Now, since the event here, Congresswoman Harman, the president of the center, for the viewers and listeners who don't know this, convened a meeting under the banner of the National Conversation here in the kickoff of that event, which for the first time the featured discussion was about your paper. And since then, there's been a lot of press coverage. Tell us about the reaction that you've received in the larger world, and how people are reacting. You've been in call-in shows, all kinds of things.
I can say that, first of all, I'm very encouraged. Puck and I are honored, we're flattered, and we're very encouraged. I'm not necessarily saying we're surprised in some ways, because both of our wives told us this would resonate with Americans, and it really has truthfully resonated.
They told you that back in 2009?
They did, absolutely. They said if once the paper is out there, Americans will will gravitate towards it, because we tried to write it in those terms.
Well, and Captain Porter can correct me if I'm wrong, I think a misreading of the paper is that it's a call for slashing the defense budget and reallocating. I mean, if one looks historically at the trend, in the 1940s we were spending 35 to 40% of GDP for World War II. Well, if you're fighting Adolf Hitler in a global, total war, that's the amount of your economy you'll devote for it. It fell to, I guess, around 12% in the Korean War, 7% Vietnam. We dipped below 4% in the post-Cold War. We're back up to around 5%. And when you think about it, it's 5% of a $16 trillion economy, so that's a huge number. But as we see now in Libya, the world actually, in the NATO countries, Secretary Gates took NATO allies to task on this, have to maintain adequate defense spending to meet the requisite, requirements that are in accord with our national interests. And there are only a few countries in NATO that are capable of really waging combat operations in tandem with the United States.
One of the themes of the paper, one of the contentions of the paper, there are three things that the paper is based on, and that is America's two enduring national interests of security and prosperity, underpinned, constrained, but also empowered by our values. The interesting thing that we say in the paper, though, is that prosperity and security are wholly interdependent. You cannot have one without the other. What people fail to recognize is there are so many different aspects of that you see played out every day. And to your point, sir, this is exactly the relationship that you see with declining economies in Europe being unable to support larger defense budgets and inclining or increasingly strong economic systems in Asia supporting what appears probably to be almost a natural military buildup from China, for instance. That's not to say that, and to your point, our contention isn't that we need to slash the military budget or build one budget or another. Our point is that we need to shape the military in the fiscal environment in which we live today to have the military that has the right capabilities and the right capacity for the jobs that the military can do, and also be aware that other elements of our government and moreover our public and private sectors need to be equally capable of applying their special talents and influence to the same problem. The military doesn't own the security of the United States any more than commerce owns the prosperity of the United States. We're all in this. Citizens own that. And there are a number of tools that need to be applied.
The question of how secure we are, how safe we are, has been asked and answered through the prism of 9/11 and the post-9/11 world, Al-Qaeda. That wouldn't work for you, obviously. You're looking at a much bigger definition of what makes a nation secure. Given your definition as outlined in the paper, how secure are we?
Well, I think this is, it is all relative. It's like, how can you give an empiric answer to how secure are we?
Well, I guess what I'm getting at, Wayne, is the notion of investment in infrastructure, investment in education, the things that will make a nation strong, but besides it's beyond its military might.
Absolutely.
We're in sort of a reductionist phase now where, led by the Tea Party, the domination of the budget debate, it's about shrinking, not growing.
I think there's a couple of things that you need to consider. First of all, one of the things that we address in the paper is that somehow in the last 20 years, it almost seems to us as though Americans have become competition averse. And it's not just economic competition, it's competition in a number of ways. Competition is what drove this nation through a market economy to be the strongest economy in the world, the strongest nation in the world. Competition in a lot of ways. So, number one, I happen to have just read Darwin's Origin of Species, and it is competition that drives natural selection to make us stronger. Clearly, we need to reinvigorate our own competitiveness across the board, and that can only be done through education and a diversity of education. So that was one reason that we said that should be kind of our priority.
Why do you think we've lost that edge?
Why do I think?
Yeah.
I think that coming out of World War II and coming out of the Cold War and the way that everything worked out globally for the United States, it was impossible for us psychologically not to have this real sense of exceptionalism and almost a sense of entitlement and dependence on legacy. And I think the time has come for us to outgrow that legacy and make a destiny of our own. Recognize that that is a renewable resource. Americans are innovative, and Americans have all of the tools we need, but you can't just sit back on your investments and hope they're going to continue to grow. No. So we need to somehow understand that we're entitled to nothing more than applying our skills as Americans to maintain our leadership role.
Rob, do you see openings here for political leadership in this regard? Is somebody willing to take this on as a major crusade?
Well, as a citizen, one can hope.
Yeah.
You know, our politics are of the character that they are in terms of the quality of the debate and the heat of the debate. And shows like this, I think, are thoughtful venues for consideration of current public policy issues. I'm a believer in sort of the pendulum theory of history, and you know, a decade ago, with your predecessor, I recall sitting on this platform talking about America and the world, and at that time, they were talking about the unipolar moment, and America is this hyperpower, as the French foreign minister put it. And today, we're talking about American decline, and I think it just as the hype, so to speak, of the unipolar moment was the case. The talk of the premature decline of the United States, I think, also needs to be taken, you know, with a grain of salt. In that, you know, even with the rise of other powers, and the paper refers to the rise of other states, that the rise of others does not axiomatically mean that the United States will decline. We'll live our relative power. Our relative power after World War II is we controlled probably half the world's GDP because the rest of the world was shattered by the war. Now we're back to our, so to speak, natural place in the global economy. And China will rise. Questions about whether China's rise can be managed or not. But I think what's really distinctive in terms of the international system now, it remains the case that no major power is seeking to overturn the global order. They're attempting to integrate into it, to affect it, to integrate in on their own terms, but we don't face a Nazi Germany or a Soviet Union. I think that's a huge advantage as we move forward. Final point on this theme of order and disorder. There are huge, again, the paper kind of references stateless zones, or zones of the world where there is not effective control by a state authority or any other authority. And what's the ability of the United States and others to affect the milieu and the opportunities for these countries? And probably in these tight economic times, and it's a challenge posed by the Arab Spring, which we hope does not become an Arab Winter, what can the United States do to support fledgling democracies there at a time when, to quote the first President Bush, our wallet is thin?
I wonder, when Rob brings up 10 years ago with my predecessor, I remember when you and I first met, Rob, we worked on a series of programs trying to define the post-Cold War era, which was less a frame for a narrative and more a search for a frame. What's the new frame? The Cold War was gone. I wonder, Wayne, in the context of the Mr. Y paper, what is the frame that you would suggest as most useful to define how we begin to think about the narrative?
A strategic ecology, recognizing that there will always be diverging and conflicting interests among stakeholders. Stakeholders aren't simply defined by a sovereignty, by a sovereign nation. In the world we live in now, there are individuals who are as empowered as many states. This is organizations, individuals, movements. But truthfully, it's seeking converging interests for this multiple winners kind of perspective. We live in such an interdependent strategic environment now. The market displays that every day. That it has to be, for Americans, I think we need to keep it values-based. As long as we can pursue our interests through the values that characterize us as Americans in as nonpartisan a way as we possibly can, for unity of effort, which
is a big challenge here.
It's critical. And in an inclusive manner. The thing that I find most hopeful about the Arab Spring, if you will, is that it was nonviolent, democratic, and it was inclusive in nature. And if there is any counter-narrative to the hateful ideologies of Al-Qaeda or other violent extremists, I think it's this inclusive nature of this organic movement, however it plays out.
I really like Captain Porter's use of the term strategic ecology, and it's the fusion of those two terms brings to mind that during the Cold War, and I think we both came professionally of age during the Cold War, and in your business, we spent enormous time thinking about deterrence theory, nuclear deterrence, and deterrence was essentially about a small probability event with high consequences, and we spent billions of dollars hedging against really small probabilities and whether a certain niche capability could have a political significance in a crisis or not. Here we are facing climate change, which is not a small probability event with high consequences. It's a known and growing probability, significant, and we can't marshal as a society an effective response to dealing with a problem of known probability and known high consequence. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a failing of the system.
Before we run out of time, there's something I want to ask you about, and Rob mentioned it in his first remarks about a surprise about the source of the paper. And that's been a hook used in much of the media that I've looked at since the national conversation when you were here. People are, oh, surprise, 2 military guys. It gets to the point where it suggests what they think you only are monolithic in your thinking, and this kind of thinking can't come from the military. How do you process that?
Probably the most interesting way I can answer is to say, I agree. And not with this comment. And the comment is that the challenges facing us in this century, 9 billion people by 2050, the challenges facing us, we recognize it in the military, we recognize it as citizens. This is why sustainability is so important, that we need to see this as an enormous opportunity for the country. The pursuit of renewable sources of energy, of food security, these are all issues that we are confronting as a world that the United States can take a leadership role in, that will reinvigorate our own economy and take us well into the century in a systemic approach of sustainability, which is improving our economy, providing for food security, and providing renewable sources of energy to offset the challenges that we see now, which are truthfully opportunities.
Hate to do this to you, gentlemen, but about 20 seconds for each of you. And the question is, how do we move forward? How do you keep the ball in the air and keep this discussion alive?
I think the starting point is developing a set of ideas that can be rigorously assessed in terms of threshold assumptions and assessing consequences as a basis for making informed public policy, which is the mission of the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Wayne Porter, you get the last word. What's your plan to keep this moving forward?
We would love to see the dialogue continued, and we're really hoping that someone picks up on the need for a National Prosperity and Security Act to try to formalize and institutionalize some of these concepts.
Well, gentlemen, thanks. We can pick this up. We'll do our job to keep the ball in the air. We'll come back and do it again, and maybe we can have Puck join us next time around.
I hope.
That's right. Thanks very much. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.